You want to know if you could be Bo, presented by Michael, Ellis, and Matthew. Today we're here to talk to you about sports. Everybody loves sports, and some people love it more than others. Some people really love it. However, whether you're a bleed purple and gold fan or just a casual observer, you still probably wonder the same thing. Could I be a stud athlete?
Speaking of pro athletes, is there anyone better than Bo? Who's Bo, you ask? Well, for those of you who've been living under the rock for the past 20 years, this is Bo Jackson. Considered by many to be the greatest athlete of all time, Bo Jackson was a dual sport freak. Starting on the Auburn baseball team the same year he won the Heisman, Bo Jackson went on to play for the NFL's Los Angeles Raiders while also playing for the Kansas City Royals. Could you be that level of awesome?
The answer is almost certainly no. Before you get all depressed about it, though, let's look at the science behind it. The answer to whether or not you could be the next Bo Jackson, it actually falls deep within each of your cell, in your genes. No, not these genes, these genes. These genes are made up of elements in your body called DMA. The genetic material provides a code for your entire physical makeup. What does that affect? Turns out a lot of things, ranging from bone density, muscle strength, blood oxygen capacity, endurance, vulnerability to injury, and numerous others. Your genes essentially decide whether or not you are a zero or a hero.
While most of you already knew that genes coded for the makeup of your body, you may not be aware of just how specific some of these can be. Alpha actin 3, also known as alpha actin skeleton muscle isoform 3, or F actin cross linking protein, is a protein in humans that is encoded by the actin 3 gene. Alpha actin is a binding protein with multiple roles in different cell types. This gene expression is limited to skeletal muscle and is expressed in fast twitch fibers, which are referred to as the gene for speed. Fast twitch fibers are all about the rapid, forceful muscle contractions like the ones used during sprinting and weightlifting. In the early 2000s, a group of scientists led by Nan Yang and Daniel MacArthur set out to investigate the genetic correlation between individuals' athletic performance and the actin 3 gene.
The way the study works was they examined three different versions of the allele. The one they were particularly after was the 577R allele, which here we're going to denote as the RR. The first case was that you would have X and X. You were homozygous for a disruptive version of the allele. Anyone in this boat most likely leaned towards the average fence. They had some indications that there might be a slight tendency towards muscular dystrophy or something like that, but overall, this lent more to the average side of the fence. The other option, which was RR, both for the 577R allele, while it didn't specifically say that you were going to be the next Usain Bolt, a surprisingly large number of Olympic caliber athletes found themselves positive for the RR gene, with an incredibly small number not having it at all. Also possible is the heterozygous gene with only one disruptive, and that fell mostly in the moderate category.
Now let's bring this back to our main man, Bo. While Bo never underwent any sort of genetic testing such as the ones offered for Actin 3, there are certain recurring themes and stories from his career that seem to lend themselves to a beast of innate genetic ability. For instance, this is a real quote from Bo on his thoughts about practice.
But it wasn't just Bo. When you watched the feats that he accomplished on and off both fields, you began to see a different pattern emerge. Quotes from coaches and quotes from reporters didn't paint the picture of a man who didn't practice. There had to be something more to this story.
When Bo Jackson's career was at its height, there was little real talk of the genes he possessed. He was simply a supernatural athlete and a once in a lifetime ball player. With modern research into the role genetic structure can play in athletic development, we begin to see that he was the winner of a genetic lottery. He was innately better than everyone around him, not because of how he trained, but because his heart pumped more blood that had more oxygen to muscles that could better absorb that oxygen than any average human being.
So that's it? You lost the genetic lottery and are now doomed to a life of mediocrity and embarrassment at the gym? Not quite. Your saving grace could already be coded into every cell in your body in a little value that you may have seen appear briefly earlier in the video. As described in his book, The Sports Gene, David Epstein describes VO2 max, or aerobic capacity, as a measure of the amount of oxygen in a person's body that is available to use when he or she is exercising. VO2 max, like actin 3, is something that can be coded into a person's DNA. So while you may not be born with a high baseline aerobic capacity, you might be what can be called a trainability time bomb. What that means is that with training, you can vastly improve your VO2 max relative to others with the same amount of training. Add a little exercise, and you could become a Superman.
The best investigation into this comes from Dr. Claude Bouchard of Pennington Biomedical Research. In the Heritage Athleticism study, Dr. Bouchard gathered 37 sedentary subjects through identical training plans to try and discover whether or not their aerobic capacities would significantly increase, and if so, by how much. For Dr. Bouchard, a majority of the results were expected. When exposed to a physically rigorous routine, every single test subject improved in health. However, that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part of the study were the top and bottom 15% of candidates. On the fringes of the data's bell curves sat two groups of people. The first group, on the lower 15% of the spectrum, saw minimal gains. No matter how much they exercised over the 5-month period, their body just didn't respond. The other side of the spectrum, however, saw absolutely massive improvements, nearing 50% increases in some cases. What's more, the study also found that between families, aka those with similar genetic coding, the improvements were remarkably similar.
However, we want to make one quick distinction. Unlike the numerous other options that pop up if you simply Google genetic athletic testing, the Heritage study has never made any claims to be a predictive study. The scientists involved were encouraged to not just study a particular gene set, but to examine which genes would make themselves most apparent in results. In that light, it is better to look at investigations into genetic signals for athletic ability not as a golden ticket to stardom, but as a step forward to the ultimate goal of the Human Genome Project. This goal, at its end, spells out that through measuring athletic indicators in genome, one might be able to predict not a person's maximum high jump, but things like whether or not they should take up yoga or swimming to combat their high cholesterol.
Unfortunately for those of you with dreams of grandeur, whether or not you could be the next Bo Jackson has likely already been decided. If you currently aren't able to leave imprints in a baseball just by squeezing it, odds are pretty good that you never will be. But viewing genetic markers for athleticism is missing the true opportunity presented by such studies. Imagine a world in which a simple test run by your doctor on your DNA could tell you that if you start running just 3 times a week, you could see absolutely astonishing increases in your personal well-being.
So what's the verdict? If you were going to be a legend, you probably would have already shown it. Just because you aren't Bo doesn't mean you don't have the potential to be great. And there are still some significant advances to be made in the field of DNA testing. The future looks really bright. But that's all the time we have for this video. Thanks for watching.